All right. Well, let's begin with the word of prayer. Dear Heavenly God, I want to thank you for yet another Sabbath day that you've given to all of us, and I want to thank you for bringing us all together again for this day of study, of immersion into your lines, your truth, your prophetic lines that you've given to us. And dear God, as we go over these lines again, these histories, and we try to learn, I pray that you will be with us. Please be with me as I present, so that I may speak clearly and in a comprehensive way. And please be with all the listeners so that they may glean truths that are maybe more pertinent to each of us individually. I pray that you watch over this technical setup so that the connection is good and everyone is able to hear and to listen and to watch as I go over this study. I pray for a blessing for all of us, and we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So today's study, we're going to continue the thread that Wouter and Mark, I think Wouter, you started it, and Mark, he did the presentation last Sabbath, and it's this theme of gay marriage. So today's presentation, I haven't written the title here because I will write a lot of things, I think, when we go through this presentation, and it's just to save some space. But the title of today's presentation is Gay Marriage, the Fight Continues. So Wouter made a nice introduction for us, and Mark, he expanded on some of the issues that happened, especially here in 1989. And just briefly, we're gonna begin with a brief recap of what we've covered so far and why we are grounded in, maybe I should stand over here, in 1989. Let me move like this. So we have discussed the importance of history and why we need to look at this subject of gay marriage. We know that it's something that we as Adventists, but also as members of the movement, due to our conservative background, have largely misunderstood for a long time. So it's super important for us to understand the topic of gay marriage, and especially also the importance of history, and to get a better understanding of why exactly we need to look at this subject. We know that it's a part of end-time prophecy for us, and it's important that we understand the subject so that we can place ourselves on the right side of the issue. So we know that Adventists, they in general use a wrong methodology, but also they don't have a right understanding of history to apply this methodology to. So, it's a bad combination of not having a right methodology, but then the methodology that you have, you apply it to a history that you, in large pieces, misunderstand. And that doesn't matter if it's biblical history or Millerite history or the histories in between or our current present time history. And it's not much better with liberal Adventism, who make similar mistakes without this refined methodology or the correct understanding of history. And because of this is why we in the movement spend so much time looking at history and really trying to just get a right understanding of the events that happened when they happened, and like following this, threading the histories, as Tess has coined the term. Because oftentimes when we lie out these histories on a line and we can connect the various waymarks, we see that there's a red thread, and it's oftentimes difficult to understand, let's say, what happened in 2001 if you don't trace it all the way back to where it started. Let's say that's in 1989. So we've looked a lot at history in general, but also in this mini series. This is the third presentation. And we looked at the history that led us to 1989 and how gay people had been persecuted and really fighted before 1989, but we see that this renewed fight, if we can call it that, really picks up the pace again in 1989. So it wasn't really until 1989 that this fight for gay marriage began. And we see, just to quickly go over it again, we saw that in 1989, Denmark was the first country that officially registered gay partnerships. We saw that in New York City, gay couples were recognized, so they didn't have the right to marry in the state, but in the city district of New York, gay couples were finally or beginning to be recognized. There is this journalist, Andrew, I think his name is Andrew Sullivan, who writes this article. We haven't really looked over it, but it's titled "A Conservative Argument for Gay Marriage," and I think Mark in his presentation last Sabbath covered it and covered some aspects of it. Then we also have the California Bar Association, which is this union of lawyers and scholars inside the legal scholars, is maybe a more correct way of saying it, who actually recommend that gay marriage should be adopted or accepted and like a nationwide thing. And also what's interesting, you know, we study a lot of history surrounding 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union, King of the South, but during the time that the Berlin Wall was falling, was being broken down, there's this German man, Matthias Freihoff, who is having his double premiere of this first gay movie titled Coming Out. So we see a lot of various significant events beginning to happen in 1989 that would kind of set the ball in motion to people standing, or more and more gay people standing up for their rights, and you know, picking legal battles to actually legalize gay marriage. So if we had to use like one sentence for 1989, we can say that 1989 is the year where it became a mainstream subject, this topic of gay marriage. Right. Also in, we did delete some of this in my first registered. I'm just going to abbreviate it, but in 1991, we have this case called, spelled right, Voor versus Lewin, and it's this case in Hawaii, where the case goes all the way up to the Hawaiian Supreme Court, and the Hawaiian Supreme Court basically says, well, that Hawaii has no constitutional right to discriminate people for in terms of marriage due to their sexual preference. So this causes the other states who watch this to panic. You know, that, well, if Hawaii's Supreme Court decided this, it will eventually come to our own state. And all of this led to, I'm just going to write DOMA year in 1993. I'm going to do it like this. The Defense of Marriage Act, which we know that a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, he signed into law. Not because he really wanted to, but because in 1996, 3 years after, it was an election year, and Bill Clinton, he needed the Republican vote for him to be re-elected. So we can write here, election. That's important to keep in mind. And also briefly, I would like to, let me see where there's some space. maybe up here, actually a good place. Good in red. So we're just gonna have like a brief outline of what 𝘂𝗏 actually is. So it was a super kind of, or maybe I shouldn't say super simple law, but it was a relatively simple law. And it consisted of 3 sections. So there was the first section, which basically was just about the name of this law or piece of legislation. Then there was the second section and the third section. Yes, 𝘂𝗏 is an abbreviation for the Defense of Marriage Act. So it was a piece of legislation that came as a response to what was happening in Hawaii when the state of Hawaii lost this case where a gay couple, they wanted to get married, but they couldn't, and they sued the state, and the Hawaiian Supreme Court decided that the state had no constitutional right to discriminate in this marriage case on the basis of sexual orientation. So that led states to panic, and as a response, the Defense of Marriage Act was introduced. So it consists of 3 sections. The first one is just about the name. It explains that actually it says the actual text is this act may be cited as the Defense of Marriage Act. So there's no substance in it. It just refers back to the name. But the second section basically says that no state has to recognize same-sex marriage from other states. So yeah, maybe I should give some more space. My record, same-sex. So not recognize same-sex marriage that happens, let's say, in a state of Hawaii, and then you get married in Hawaii, a state that accepts same-sex marriage. You couldn't just fly to, let's say, Idaho, where you're from, and then automatically be considered married in the eyes of the state. So not recognize same-sex marriage in other states. That was what section 2 was about. And section 3 was that the federal government didn't recognize gay marriage at all. So I'm just going to write Fed.
Does that mean that that if we are married in a state that does recognize it, if we then move to another state, they won't recognize it, even though we're married in another state?
Exactly. So that state that you're originally from, and you come back to it after being married in a different state, your own state or your home state would not recognize it if it wasn't allowed in your state. And the federal government didn't recognize same-sex marriage anywhere. So the federal government does provide some benefits to married couples. We know that also in today's society, there's some protections, some legal protections and so on. But this Defense of Marriage Act basically said that the federal government doesn't recognize same-sex marriage. It only recognizes marriage between a man and a woman. So it's important to see again this red thread that 𝘂𝗏 came as a result of this lawsuit, Voor versus Lewin. States panicked. Legislation was set up to protect these other states which were afraid. So, and we're going to refer back to this because this presentation is titled "The Fight Continues," and we are going to focus on the fight that happens onwards, and it logically makes sense that this fight continues and it is surrounding the Defense of Marriage Act. So it's important to have it up there in the corner. I hope you can see it. Can you see it, or is it too small? It's fairly small. I see that. I apologize. It's super small. Well, I cannot really do anything about it. I'm gonna refer back to it. Yeah, I'm trying to move the. Oh, yeah, I can show it briefly. Maybe you can remember it then. So it's like first one is the name. Then we have the section 2, not recognizing same-sex marriage in other states. And number 2 is that the federal government doesn't recognize same-sex marriage. Yeah, I apologize for the small writing, or the tiny writing.
It's clear.
It's clear. Okay, it's good. Right. So a nice way that I really like how Tess, she visualizes this Defense of Marriage Act. I can quickly do that before we move on. Is that we say that this is a state. You get married in this state where gay marriage is allowed. Then section 2 basically says like this. Let's say these stripes are all the other states. You get married here, but this Defense of Marriage Act section 2 basically annuls your marriage in all of these states. It's not recognized. And section 2, what it does is basically section 2, section 3, sorry. The federal government doesn't recognize it either. So effectively, the Defense of Marriage Act is isolating your marriage to that place where it was legal and avoids the spread of it. So this is a nice model to keep in mind. Let's continue. Right, so in 1996, Bill Clinton, he needed the Republican vote to get reelected. So he actually signed this Defense of Marriage Act into law. But later on, he actually says that he regretted it and he opposes it. This was before it was overturned. Bill Clinton. And just to show, I've already said that the states are afraid of this law or this legalization of same-sex marriage spreading to their states. So DOMA was passed, but DOMA is not actually enough for a lot of these states. So in 2004, 11 states in the United States, they amended their constitutions and they actually defined marriage as being only valid between one man and one woman. So they put it in their state constitutions because then, a case like this, Voor versus Lewin in the state of Hawaii couldn't happen because the Hawaiian Supreme Court, they looked at their state's constitution and, their state's constitution didn't have this explicit written language that defined marriage as being between one man and one woman. But then these other states going forward, they made sure that this couldn't happen by including it in their constitution. So a potential lawsuit would be struck down because you always refer back to the supreme or the constitution of your state. So in 2004, 11 states, they amended their constitutions because DOMA was not enough for them. And 1 year later, 2 more states amended their constitution. So we're now in 2007 or in 2005. And then in 2006, 8 additional states also amended their constitution to only include marriage between one man and one woman. Yes.
Do you know why DOMA wasn't enough?
So it was because that they wouldn't. I think it's because that DOMA, it kind of isolates your marriage to just the state that you're being wed in or married in. But if you change the actual constitution of, let's say it's your own state, then you couldn't, there's no way to get married in the state because there's no loophole anymore. So I think it's just to seal this last crack in the law, maybe you could say, so that nobody could get either married or recognized in their state by the federal government or your own state or anything. So it was just to make it full circle. So we see a rapid progression of states changing their constitutions to, avoid gay marriage being a thing in their states. So a way to say it was to deal with this Hawaiian problem that arose here in 1991. But we also see some kind of progression. So even though some states, we're speaking about 2004, 2005, 2006, they say that marriage is only between one man and one woman. Despite of that, in 2001, we see that Arkansas, which is a very conservative state, that by now, Arkansas in 2001 decides to decriminalize homosexual or homosexuality. So before 2001, it was actually a crime. Like you would be sent to prison in Arkansas for just being homosexual. So maybe they say that, you cannot get married as a homosexual, but at least in quotation marks, it's not illegal anymore. So Arkansas decriminalize homosexuality. And also we see in 2001 that Netherlands becomes the first country in the world that actually legalizes gay marriage. But I think maybe Canada was before it, but it wasn't it wasn't enacted before 2 years later. But the first gay couple actually got married in Canada, but it was only kind of put into place legal-wise a few years later. So Netherlands gets the credit. There's also Canada was kind of there before. And last of that. Yeah. Then we have, if we look at the United States again and the developments that are taking place in the States in 2004. I'm going to do like this. We have Massachusetts as the first state in the United States that legalizes same-sex marriage. But also what happens after 2004 is like this war, so to speak, cultural war or internal war over gay marriage really begins. We see that in 2009, 5 years after Massachusetts legalizes same-sex marriage, there is an attempt by two lawmakers, one in the Senate, one in the House, to repeal DOMA, and they want to repeal DOMA by introducing this respect for marriage act. I think it's called, yes, RFMA, which no, it's not an E, it's an F. Respect for Marriage Act. So it's just like against this Defense of Marriage Act. It wants to legalize marriage for same-sex people. Basically, it goes against what DOMA originally did. So it's an effort to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act. And we also see in 2004, or not, no, sorry, in 2009, we get introduced to Eddie Windsor and the Spire. They were a lesbian couple from New York City, which we will get introduced to in just a minute, or maybe now, actually. I think it's a good place to introduce them now. I think I'm going to share my screen in just a moment. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. I'll read some things together. Share screen. You see my, yeah, you see my screen, I see. Okay. So I want to, in my preparation, I read a little bit about like 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗃 and 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗃. 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗃 is unfortunately dead. She died the whole lawsuit that came about, which was known as Windsor versus, I think, the United States, or let me see. Yeah, Windsor versus United States was Thea's partner, 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗃, that you see here on the screen. But I thought it would be nice to maybe like get to know them a little bit more, their story, before going into the legal case. So like, let's read this in brief first. I'm going to read. When Eddie Windsor's wife died after 44 years together, Eddie was required to pay taxes that a straight widow would not have to pay. Her lawsuit against the federal government went all the way to the Supreme Court. The case that bears her name overturned the federal government's ban on recognizing same-sex marriages. Eddie Windsor and her wife, 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗃, were a Jewish lesbian couple whose life in late 20th century New York reflected the increasing visibility of LGBT people in the decades after the Stonewall Uprising. Before Eddie became a full-time activist, she was a computer programmer at IBM in the early days of a male-dominated field. Okay. So this was like the introduction to Eddie Windsor and 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗃. They were a couple that were together for 44 years. So they had a really strong commitment to each other, and I think they got married outside of the United States in Canada. But after Thea died, her partner, Eddie Windsor, had to, because their marriage wasn't recognized in the federal eyes, she had to pay a lot of taxes. It was more than $300,000 in, I think, estate taxes to the federal government, because the federal government didn't recognize their marriage like they would a straight couple. Let me see what I want to read here. Yes, so maybe from here at 23. At 23, Eddie moved to New York City. She realized that if she didn't have a husband to support her, she would need a profession. So she enrolled in a master's program in mathematics at New York University. She graduated in 1957 and went to work for IBM, where she designed systems architecture and language processors. Needless to say, there were very few women in her group. Eddie loved her work and eventually rose to the title of Senior Systems Programmer, the highest technical title at the company. So just a little bit about Eddie Windsor's background. I thought it interesting that they, both of them were Jewish. It must have been even harder for them to go against their family religion and so on, to live out their full identity as being homosexual. I'm going to read this part as well. In the early years, Eddie was terrified of being found out because it was illegal at the time to be homosexual in the United States. While at NYU, she worked on a computing project for the Atomic Energy Commission and was interviewed by the FBI for a security clearance. Being gay then meant being barred from working for the federal government. But it turned out the FBI was more interested in Eddie's sister's union activities. Still, Eddie later recalled, I found out that impersonating a man was illegal, so I wore crinolines and a marvelous dress to meet the FBI. I don't know what crinolines are, I didn't look it up, but she really tried to like be someone she wasn't in this meeting with the FBI because she was so afraid to being found out. And now we're going to move into like Eddie Winter's history with 𝗃𝗏. So Eddie met 𝗃𝗏, a psychologist, in 1963 at a Greenwich village restaurant called Portofino, known underground as Where the Lesbians Go. They danced all night, though they didn't become a serious couple until 2 years later. On Memorial Day weekend 1967, so this is 4 years later, 𝗃𝗏 proposed. Knowing that a diamond engagement ring would draw too many questions at work, she gave Eddie a diamond brooch to symbolize their commitment. It was 2 years before the Stonewall Uprising and 36 years before Massachusetts became the first US state to allow same-sex couples to marry. A documentary film about their life together is called Eddie and 𝗃𝗏, A Very Long Engagement, and this is a photo of 𝗃𝗏. Yes, here it says Eddie and 𝗃𝗏 were both Jewish, though neither was traditionally observant. Let me see what I want to highlight. 𝗃𝗏 was born in Amsterdam, in Holland, funny enough, in 1931 to a wealthy Jewish family that managed to escape the Holocaust, fleeing first to England and then to the United States. Here, I want to highlight this. By 1967, Eddie and 𝗃𝗏 had moved in together in Greenwich Village and bought a beach house in Southampton, where they spent the next 40 summers. They loved to dance and entertain. 𝗃𝗏 was a good cook, and they hosted elaborate parties for friends, including annually on Memorial Day to celebrate their anniversary. Although Eddie was never out of work, in the years after the Stonewall, Eddie and 𝗃𝗏 marched in the village with the Gay Liberation Front. When IBM moved Eddie's group out of the city in 1975, she took a buyout. So I guess she had some shares maybe, and she had the option to leave and sell her shares. She created a computer consulting company and devoted herself to local gay and lesbian activism and to 𝗃𝗏. In 1977, 𝗃𝗏 was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Though her mobility decreased over the decades, she continued her career as a clinical psychologist, seeing patients until the very last day of her life. The couple continued to dance, swim, and entertain. Eventually, their dancing style adapted to Eddie sitting on 𝗃𝗏's lap in her wheelchair. In the last years of 𝗃𝗏's life, Eddie became her full-time caregiver. So I was really touched when I read this section about them and just really reading about their love, how strong and deep it actually was for each other. I'm gonna read on a little bit more. Prohibited from marrying, Eddie and 𝗃𝗏 had no rights as a couple under the law. When Eddie sought to name 𝗃𝗏 as the beneficiary of her IBM pension, she was rebuffed. But by the early 1990s, decades of LGBT activism were beginning to bear fruit, with state and local non-discrimination ordinances and domestic partnership registries offering some legal recognition to couples. When New York City created a registry in 1993, Eddie wanted them to be among the first. 𝗃𝗏 demurred, saying she had patients scheduled all day, to which Eddie replied, "I have waited more than 28 years for this day, and I am not waiting a single day more." 𝗃𝗏 cleared her calendar, bought flowers, and they went down to the municipal building. In 2003, Massachusetts' highest court held that the state had no constitutionally adequate reason to deny civil marriage to same-sex couples. Eddie and 𝗃𝗏 hoped they would eventually be able to marry in New York, but as 𝗃𝗏's health deteriorated, they could not wait any longer. In 2007, they traveled to Toronto, Canada, where marriage had been open to same-sex couples for 4 years, and married with a few best friends in attendance. 𝗃𝗏 died 2 years later in February 2009. And now we're going to transition more into the actual lawsuit, which paved the way for some aspects or sections of DOMA being repealed. So Thea's death left 𝘃𝗶𝗱𝗲𝗏 with a $363,053 federal tax bill. A straight widow with the same estate would have owed nothing, but the Defense of Marriage Act, passed by Congress in 1996, as we've seen, barred the federal government from recognizing any marriages of same-sex couples. At the time the law passed, there were none, although gay couples could not marry anywhere in the world. Litigation in Hawaii was on the verge of changing that. Congress, in an anti-gay panic, passed DOMA to preempt equal rights. Again, we have covered this, that DOMA was basically an act that was passed in this anti-gay panic, triggered by the Hawaiian litigation. Right, so now we've read so much, we can read the last part to understand the actual lawsuit, this 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗏𝗏 versus the United States. 𝘃𝗏 decided to sue. She first called the venerable gay rights group Lambda Legal, but they declined to take the case, feeling that a wealthy woman's tax bill wasn't a sympathetic vehicle for challenging DOMA. 𝘃𝗏 next called Roberta Robbie Kaplan, a lesbian partner at Paul Weiss, Rifkind, Warden, and Garrison, an elite law firm that had done gay rights cases pro bono. Kaplan took the case, eventually in collaboration with the ACLU. 𝘃𝗏 won at the district court, the circuit court, and then the Supreme Court by a vote of 5-4 in 2013. As a result of the Supreme Court's decision in Windsor versus the United States, all married couples are now fully recognized by the federal government. So, just to make a brief pause, so it says here that because of Windsor's lawsuit, because she had to pay this enormous amount of taxes, one aspect of DOMA was repealed, and it was Section 3. So following the lawsuit, Section 3 no longer existed or was valid in DOMA. Right, all married couples are now fully recognized by the federal government. This is in 2013, so here somewhere. For taxes, social security benefits, immigration, and much more. Just 2 years later, the court ruled that no state could exclude same-sex couples from the right to marry, legalizing same-sex marriage, but we're going to come to that. And marriage equality became the law of the land. So what we see is that 𝘃𝗏 Windsor decides to sue, and on the basis of an unfair tax basis, and she actually ends up changing or repealing a really big section of the Defense of Marriage Act. 𝘃𝗏 Windsor and Thea Spire was the couple's name. So Thea, she died, but they were together for 44 years. Right. Let me see if I have some more quotes to share. I don't think so. I'm going to pause my share. So jumping back to the timeline, I think you can see the screen again now. Is that correct? Yeah. In 2012. So here.
We still see your screen share.
Oh, you still see my screen share. Stop share. Like this. Right. Thanks for letting me know. In 2012, so we were just here, this legislation was introduced, the Respect for Marriage Act, but it wasn't passed. But it was one of the points or one of the steps in this war against war for same-sex marriage that was introduced. It didn't actually end up overturning DOMA, but 𝘃𝗏 Windsor's lawsuit versus the United States ended up changing Section 3. But in 2012, which was an election year again, I'm just gonna put EY for election year. We see the Republic National Convention convening and the Democratic National Convention convening, and they have to actually take a stance on same-sex marriage, because until now they didn't really need to have it in their political program. And the RNC, the Republican National Convention, basically, and not surprisingly, they state officially that They are anti-gay marriage. I'm just gonna say anti, and we have the Democratic National Convention. They're pro, so officially in their like political program, and this can be seen as a type of formalization in the external line or history. Right. We talked about 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗃𝗃 taking down DOMA Section 3. After she sued, they were engaged for 40 years, married in Canada in 2007, and Thea died in 2009. So we can put like across that 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗃𝗃 died in 2009, which was why 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗃𝗃 sued. Going to the line again. So in 2012, we have the Democratic and Republican parties stating their official position regarding same-sex marriage. And it was also in, I think it was in 2012, actually, that the Windsor versus the United States case was first brought up. It wasn't decided here, but it was brought up here. And in 2013, I'm going to put it here. A 5-4 majority decides that Windsor is right, and Section 3 needs to be overturned. But it's important to note that there wasn't like a big majority. It was 5-4, and the conservative dissenting side, they were not happy about this decision. I think I'm gonna read some more now. Just check. No, we're gonna wait a little bit more, but what we see is that following this decision, where the federal government cannot enforce Section 3 of DOMA or anymore, it's not valid. Before 2014, so in 2013, only 33% of the states permitted same-sex marriage, but after 2014, that number rose to 65. So while this case was going on with Eddie Windsor versus the United States, there were also other like smaller rulings taking place in each state where slowly same-sex marriage was winning these court cases at the lower court levels, but it was happening all around the country. And in 2014, having all this history in mind, 18 states actually legalize same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage, I'm just gonna write like this. And now I'm gonna read some things. So I'm gonna share my screen. Share screen. You see my screen? Let me zoom in a little bit. Right, so it's from an article from the Boston Globe titled 2014 was a pivotal year for same-sex marriage. A year ago, only about 1/3 Americans lived in states that permitted same-sex marriage. Today, meaning in 2014, nearly 65% of Americans do, making 2014 perhaps the biggest turning point in the history of same-sex marriage in the United States. The change wasn't driven by a bevy of new laws or a big Supreme Court decision. Instead, it was a slow-burning sequence of consistent lower court rulings combined with the Supreme Court's decision not to intervene. Massachusetts was the first state to allow same-sex marriage. In the 10 years since then, same-sex marriage has spread to 34 other states, including 18 new states just this year. States that continue to ban the practice tend to be concentrated in the Midwest, in the South and Midwest. So things are happening in 2014, and it's super interesting to me that, you know, the Supreme Court doesn't intervene, but the Supreme Court looks at these lower court rulings and they see that everyone is basically in agreement. You know, same-sex marriage wins every single case. So there's no reason for the Supreme Court to intervene. I think there's a quote describing this later on. What drove this year's expansion of same-sex marriage was a streak of victories in federal courts, especially in the upper courts that make law for whole regions of the country. Various statewide bans on same-sex marriage were declared unconstitutional. At first, many of those rulings were put on hold, which is not uncommon. Sometimes lower courts want to hit the pause button and let the Supreme Court weigh in before implementing big social changes. But in October 2014, the Supreme Court decided not to intervene. It didn't say why, but it may be because there was no dispute for them to resolve, since the pro-marriage side had won every single case. This paved the way for same-sex marriage to become legal in several states, leading to a streak of victories for marriage equality. So same-sex marriage is slowly winning court cases after court cases. Shortly after the Supreme Court decided not to review those earlier cases, a disagreement finally occurred. The Sixth Circuit, which covers Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, became the first court to uphold a state ban on same-sex marriage. And as I say here, the article then explains how the Supreme Court may now want to intervene because now there is a disagreement, and this is what the Supreme Court basically does. It like decides when the lower court or a court underneath them has a dispute or disagreement in some sense. So as pivotal as 2014 has been in the history of gay marriage, 2015 may be definitive. So now we are, let me see we are in 2015 here. Where there's another court case, and yes, we're going to come to that. So as pivotal as 2014 has been in the history of gay marriage, 2015 may be definitive. If the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay marriage, the United States would join the growing ranks of countries that have embraced it. Alternatively, a Supreme Court ruling against gay marriage would force the issue back to the states, potentially leading to a dramatic retrenchment in the number of same-sex couples who are able to marry. I'm going to stop my screen share now. So in 2015, on the basis of Windsor and United States, there is another couple, not a lesbian couple this time, but a gay couple, and their name is John Arthur and 𝗔𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗿. Annabeth is just saying that, what is that series called? Amend, right? There's a Netflix series called Amend, where it goes through the history of the United States from, I think some of you have seen it, from slavery and how slavery was changed, and like the civil rights movements. And the last episode is about like rights for gay and trans people, and it highlights the story of 𝗔𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗏, and it's actually quite a nice episode. I think we highly recommend it. Yeah, to those who haven't seen it, of course. Right, so John Arthur and 𝗔𝗶𝗴𝗏𝗏, they see what's happening with Eddie Windsor's court case lawsuit, and they decide to get married. They want to get married. I think it's 𝗔𝗶𝗴𝗏𝗏 who says to John, let's get married. Yes, John, he became eventually very sick, and we're gonna go into his story now. Let me see where this article. So they were basically they were also a couple together. They had been together for many years, and 𝗶𝗶𝗃𝗲𝗃 versus Hodges, as the case court was later coined. It was this court case that, you know, allowed or was the basis for the United States legalizing same-sex marriage. So it's quite important. I'm gonna just quickly share my screen. I want to show a photo of 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗲𝗃𝗃 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃 and John Arthur. So I hope you can see my screen. So this is 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃, and this is John Arthur, and this is them on their way on the private medical plane that they, through the help of their friends and families, chartered for $13,000 to actually fly to a state where they could get married. This was before the legalization of same-sex marriage. And because John Arthur, he was very sick, he had ALS, so he was paralyzed, and you know, they got married just as they touched down on the tarmac. I don't remember where it was, in Washington or Chicago. But either way, they had to fly to a state where they could get married because it was illegal in their state. And yeah, this was how it looked like. So this can also be seen. There are clips in this series from Amend where they actually showed this happening, and it's super, super touching. I'm going to stop my screen share again. Let me see. So it says here, I'm going to read from an article. Arthur, which I just showed you, the man that was sick and lying in this bed-like thing in the plane. Arthur was essentially on his deathbed when the couple decided to marry. He could no longer walk. Speaking was difficult. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, which attacks the body's motor neurons, was rapidly destroying his body. 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃 stayed at Arthur's bedside. Their friends had to beg him to leave the house to take a break. And they were also together for more than 2 decades, and they had often talked about marriage, but never considered it seriously because they didn't want it to be symbolic. They wanted their marriage, like many other same-sex couples, they wanted their marriage to have legal weight, just like the marriages of heterosexuals. But it says here, as I explained to you just a few minutes ago, but in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key portion of the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, giving same-sex married couples federal benefits in the states where such unions were legal. And 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃, Arthur's partner, he saw the news online, leaned over, as it says here in the article, kissed Arthur on the head and said, "Let's get married." And Arthur, he said, "Okay." So it says here that they needed to travel to different states, and they chose Maryland on a friend's suggestion, and they had to charter a medical flight because it was their only option due to Arthur's sickness, or ALS. And they found the $13,000 needed to pay for it, and friends and family, they helped. So on the morning of July 11, 2013, an ambulance transported them to the airport, where they boarded a medical jet with a nurse and Arthur's aunt, who became ordained online to perform weddings. They flew to Baltimore, Washington International Marshall Airport. Roberts began the ceremony on the tarmac in the plane. Shortly after landing, the couple held hands, 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃's thumb rubbing Arthur's. They stared into each other's eyes. They got married. So it's just a really touching story. I'm going to share now a few quotes that I have left with you. And it strikes me how much their story, you know, is similar to Eddie Windsor's or 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃. Both couples have been together for many decades, and they simply, well, maybe not they wanted to get married as well, and they had to hide and do things in secret, but they wanted their marriage to have this legal weight where they were just recognized like every other person, and they had their rights. So I'm going to share my screen now, reading here from this article that begins with 𝗶𝗏𝗃𝗲𝗃𝗃. So there was no honeymoon, of course, and a few days after they wed, 𝗶𝗏𝗃𝗲 and Arthur, a few days after they wed, an old neighbor mentioned the situation to 𝗂𝗽𝗏𝗴𝗃𝗃𝗏𝗃, a local civil rights attorney. I knew right away they had a problem, 𝗂𝗽𝗏𝗴𝗃𝗏 said, and I knew they probably weren't thinking about it. Who thinks about a death certificate after getting married? And yeah, it's interesting to see how many of these changes really begin to be fought when a partner is going to lose one another. But in their cases, it's because they didn't have the rights. Like, you had to pay a crazy amount of taxes because you weren't recognized. And here as well, like, whose name was going to be on the death certificate because they were married. And I think John Arthur, he wanted his name to be changed to John 𝗂𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃. Reading on, and he keeps reminding himself about what his fight is really about, the death certificate, the title of spouse, even as he feels the growing pressure of a monumental civil rights moment. It's hard to put into words, 𝗂𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃 said, how to grasp that our decision to stand up and say, this isn't right, is going to affect so many people. So he takes it to court, and on the 26th of June, 2015, the US Supreme Court ruled in 𝗂𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗏 versus Hodges, which was the representative that represented the United States, that the 14th Amendment requires all US state laws to recognize same-sex marriages. And this left Section 2 of DOMA as superseded and unenforceable. So Windsor versus the United States eradicated Section 3 of DOMA, and 𝗂𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗏 versus Hodges basically annulled Section 2 of DOMA. So there wasn't a state that couldn't recognize same-sex marriage because the Constitution allowed for it. Yeah, let me stop my screen share. So we see how actually everything started back here with Voor versus Lewin. There's a panic against this which we have studied extensively before, this group threat. And the group threat is homosexuals having rights, basically. Homosexuals slowly beginning to, being able to wed and to have marriage rights like heterosexual couples. And there's this mobilization that takes place to prevent and lock in this group threat so it doesn't spread. It comes down to DOMA. DOMA is passed, which works in the sense that homosexuals, they don't have rights, and they're not recognized in many states. Only in some states they're recognized, but still they don't have federal rights or benefits. And then this war begins against DOMA and against the prohibitions that comes with DOMA and the legalization of same-sex marriage, with Eddie Windsor taking down Section 3 and 𝗂𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃 taking down Section 2, and effectively then, legalizing same-sex marriage in every single state. And yes, today same-sex marriage is legal in all American states. So we should also ask ourselves the question, like in this history, because it can quickly seem like a story of success, and it is for same-sex marriage. But do you think that the conservative side was happy in all of this? Because remember, they see that they're basically losing all along this line, and they're losing this culture war as they deem it. And then we shouldn't be surprised here, if we say this is 2016 and we see the rising of Donald Trump, that he comes as their savior. And the conservatives, they don't really care how their savior looks like in terms of Trump. The important thing for them is that, they have a savior, and he's coming to help them in this time and to reverse this losing that they have incurred over and over and over again. So it's important to have this history in mind, where we see Donald Trump rises up, and it all culminates, we can say, in January 6th, just a few years ago. And we physically see this mobilization against the group threat, and the group threat has just been growing and growing and growing for the conservative sides. And it's also a good place to make a parallel to the Millerite times, with the literal civil war that was happening at that time. That the feeling that, let's say, the slave owners they had, and the pro-slavery people that they had, they felt that they were deeply wronged with slaves suddenly having rights, and in the same way as white people had. They had this deep feeling of injustice that was happening to them, and we saw that culminating in lynchings and in severe racism and so on. And we should see a similar threat here as well, although maybe not as overt as it was in the case of slavery, but still the sentiment, this deep feeling of being wronged is there for the conservatives also in our time. And Republicans, they were the anti gay marriage party. I don't actually know what their official party position is today. I don't think you can be you can't be anti same-sex marriage today, because you're going to lose every single election in some way or another. So maybe they have changed or tweaked their official party document or whatever, but still, it's important to remember that Republicans, they were super hurt when they kept losing and kept losing and kept losing, and this hurt still sits with them today. And 𝘃𝗍 mentions an analogy of it's like sometimes when you're in an argument and you can see the other person is actually right in what they're saying, but you're so stubborn that you're just gonna dig your heels in and you're gonna resist the other person, even though you see the logic in what that person is saying, and even though you see that the other person is right, and you're just gonna dig your heels in. Or like a kid in a supermarket who doesn't get the candy that he wants, you're just gonna lay down on the floor and say, I'm not going anywhere. And it's the same thing that we've seen actually with the Republican Party. And now we know why, maybe because it's not just because of the same-sex marriage thing, but it's the fact that they've kept losing this culture war, which is really important for them, because they see a threat, they see a group threat arising, and they lose and lose and lose. So therefore, the Republicans also today, and we've seen it under the Obama administration with Mitch McConnell, blocking everything, just blocking and resisting everything, not being cooperative, and just being like this kid in the supermarket who's just going to lay down on the floor and not do anything. So just doing a quick recap, we saw how the fight for gay marriage began in 1989. Denmark being the first country that officially had a registered partnership that was allowed for gay or homosexual people, same-sex people. New York City begins to recognize gay couples. Andrew Sullivan, he makes this article, A Conservative Case for Gay Marriage, which was quite impactful at the time. The California State Bar Association recommends to legalize same-sex marriage, and also in the fall of the Berlin Wall, we actually see that during the time where the King of the South is actually falling, we see, if we look for it, that a major thing is also happening on the side of or in this story of same-sex marriage and gay people and their rights. Then we see various lawsuits paving the way eventually in 2015 for legalizing same-sex marriage in the United States. It all begins with Voor versus Lewin in the state of Hawaii. As a consequence of this lawsuit, which they won, states have this anti-gay panic, as we read in the article, and DOMA is introduced in 1993. Bill Clinton signs it into law, even though he doesn't really support it, he has said afterwards. And despite of various states changing their state constitutions to explicitly say that marriage is between a man and a woman. We see some progress, if you can call it that, decriminalizing homosexuality in 2001. When I think about it, it sounds totally crazy that, in 2001, in this century, it was a crime to be homosexual, and Netherlands becomes the first official, I think, country in the world to legalize not gay sex marriage, but same-sex marriage, which is also not that far ago when we think about it. And also, thinking about 2015, it's 8 years ago that this, I don't know, primary country in the world, the United States, legalized same-sex marriage. To me, it's just mind-boggling. Then we see, and we get to know a little bit more about the story of 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗏 and 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗃, where 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗏 she sues because 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗃 left her an inheritance after she died in 2009, and 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗃, sues the United States over this, and she wins, and thus Section 3 of DOMA is repealed. The federal government now has to recognize same-sex marriage, and also at the same time in 2009, the Respect for Marriage Act is introduced, but it's never passed into law. But there's some efforts going on to fight against DOMA and fight for gay marriage. In 2012, an election year, we see that both big primary political parties in the United States, they state their positions in terms of gay marriage. The Republican Party is against it. The Democratic Party is for it. It's pro same-sex marriage. And in that same year, Windsor versus United States begins to, being heard in the Supreme Court. And the following year, in 2013, 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗏 wins with a 5-4 majority, and that's when this Section 3 is cancelled, so to speak. We see that 2014 is a significant year for same-sex marriage. Before 2013, 33% of the states legalized same-sex marriage. In 2014, 18 states legalized same-sex marriage, and thus after 2014, the number has now jumped from 33 to 65% of states allowing for same-sex marriage. And on the basis of 𝘂𝗶𝗴𝗏's lawsuit, we see 𝗃𝗶𝗴𝗏 saying to John Arthur, his partner for more than 20 years, let's get married. Now suddenly they're optimistic and they see they have a chance. And what ends up happening is that, 𝗂𝗶𝗏𝗏 versus Hodges is the lawsuit that allows for same-sex marriage in the United States in 2015, not that many years ago. So that was a brief recap, and let's close with a prayer. Dear Heavenly God, I want to thank you for showing your light on this very important history surrounding same-sex marriage and just the right for people who have a different sexual orientation to being fully able to love each other and to just being recognized in the eyes of the state. Thank you for leading us down this path to seeing the significance of this and to actually learning more about it and understanding the various lawsuits deeper so that we can see this red thread that is running through this history until our present day, because we see that a lot of these events are still very relevant and they still have an impact in today's world. And I'm sure that though we think that we understand a lot of these things, there's still a lot of hidden truths and things that we need to learn, things we need to understand to properly understand where we are today and where we are going and where we should be going and what our position should be. Lord, I pray that everyone that listened to this presentation got something out of it, that each person could take something away that maybe touched them or helped them understand this issue of same-sex marriage and just the entire fight that had been going on for so many years and affected so many people in the United States and still affect so many people. We know that in Africa in particular, people are being persecuted even more now with laws being passed that effectively persecutes them and sends them in jail, and maybe even gives them death sentences for loving in a different way that the majority sees as a threat. And God, we just want to pray for all those people that are affected, and also to help us, to take the right stance and being able to see these issues in its proper light. I thank you for this Sabbath day, that we were able to come together to study, that the connection was good and that everything went fine. And I pray for all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.